You are about to enter the Shockwave Skull Sessions podcast on shockwaveskullsessions.com. And now your host, Bob Nalbandian.
This episode is titled The Great Status Quo Controversy. Why a controversy? Because nobody in America knows who the hell Status Quo is. Probably one of, if not the biggest international rock and roll band, but nobody here in America knows who they are. So we're going to educate people on this podcast. And I'm one of the ignorant ones. I never really got into Status Quo. I was well aware of them in the probably in the late 70s and through the early 80s. Bought a few of their albums used. By then, I was well into the new wave of British heavy metal and never really understood their impact or their international appeal until much later. So anyway, on this podcast, we are joined by my old friend and colleague, Mr. John Strednansky, the former editor and publisher of the great 80s metal zine, Metal Rendevous. And also, as many of you may know, John Strednansky is my co-producer on the Inside Metal project, Bay Area Godfathers. That is the upcoming Inside Metal movie title. It will be done in the next month or so. So we plan on doing some screenings the very beginning of the new year and also have a release date probably, I would say, early spring of 2020, so definitely be on the lookout for that. John Strednansky is joined by his good friend and guitarist, Mick Gilbert, who John has worked with in the Bay Area many, many years ago in the band Dammaj, Dammaj, who were a groundbreaking Bay Area metal band. Of course, Mick is originally from the UK and quite possibly the biggest Status Quo fan, at least that I've ever met. He joins John as well as the great returning Shockwave Skull Sessions regular. Everybody loves Mr. Martin Popoff. So great discussion. And once again, even if you're not familiar with the band Status Quo, this is a must listen because it will definitely not only educate you, but really bring new light to how big this band is internationally. So we're going to go through the band's entire catalog, and it's a long one here, about an hour and a half. So without further ado, let's get started. Shockwave Skull Sessions, episode 39. We might get a little bit of an echo because we have three of us here. We have Mick Gilbert from Dammaj, the old Bay Area metal band, or I should say British band originally, right?
Probably, 75%, John?
Yeah. You may remember, Martin, his brother Rich, was a lead guitar player. At one point was considered potentially to join UFO, and Mick's been just an old friend of mine forever and ever, and the biggest Quo fan ever. So this is going to be a good discussion.
Yeah. I'm sure he has a Par Records album, don't you, Martin?
Yeah, Dammaj was awesome, right? 1987. Rush. That thing was awesome. I had it as an 8 out of 10 in my old collector's guidebook.
Thank you.
Except Martin, you should hear the rough mixes. They're so much better than the final mixes.
Awesome for 86. I mean, it sounded really good anyways.
All right, Shockwave Skull Sessions. Long time in the making, this Status Quo. Not something that I was really so keen on. Being an American, the band Status Quo never made an impact here in America for him. We'll get into that too. But I know John Strednansky, Martin Popoff here, and of course our newest guest, our first-time guest on the Skull Sessions, Mick Gilbert from the Bay Area early 80s metal band Dammaj, Dammaj. What's going on, Mick?
Doing very well, thanks, Bob.
And if you do recognize the accent, he is originally British. Were you a part of that, all the new wave of British heavy metal scene, or you came just prior to that breaking?
Year to that, yeah. Obviously, I got into many of those bands because then music was starting to get good. Great period for music.
What year did you come over to the San Francisco Bay Area?
Came in 76.
Well, you came pretty early on then.
I was nearly 17 years old, so not a very good age to come and be yanked out by your roots,
right?
And leave everything behind, but it's been very good for us, I must say.
Well, Dammaj definitely made some damage in the Bay Area. You had a great album in, 86 it came out? Or
it came out in 86. It should have come out in 84, which would have, I think, made a difference in many ways. Timing is everything. And by then, thrash had sort of taken off pretty good. So I think our tempos were pretty slow for what people... but they wanted faster stuff.
And you can find out more about Mick and Dammaj. He is featured in the new upcoming Inside Metal movie called Bay Area Godfathers, and we'll show you a little bit of some roughs on that later on. It'll be out the beginning of the new year, so definitely something to look forward to. And John Strednansky, my co-producer on the project, he's here with us. Of course, John, again, a long-time, huge Status Quo fan, always pushing me to do a Status Quo podcast. So here it is. Strednansky, of course, people may remember Metal Rendevous magazine, who I was a part of, the L.A. correspondent.
Yes,
and,
you were.
back in the 80s, and back getting into metal again, St. Brad.
Yeah, just hanging out here. So happy to discuss Quo. As you know, I've been pushing them forever and ever. Actually, when they had, and we'll get to it later, when they had that one album out in the U.S. in the late 80s, the record company asked me to write the bio for the release. So even back then, I was already known as the Quo expert. But I think Mick's will have me beat on that expertise thing today.
Well, let's see what Martin Popoff has in store. I know Martin Popoff is the expert on everything hard rock and metal. So, and Martin
he beat on Quo.
He did send me like an email. He says, "Hey, Bob, just so you know, I'm not like an expert on Quo, but I think you'll manage quite well on this." But it's always good to get the difference of opinions, and of course, this will be the one and only podcast where you will hear me shut up during this episode because I'm a fan of the band. Again, here in the States, and before we get going, I kind of want to get you guys' take on Quo, because obviously, people that don't know, John grew up in Germany. Of course, we said Mick grew up in England, and all over Europe and England, Status Quo were literally like the Rolling Stones.
It's I don't know if it's changed, but I remember that Quo were well known for having more top 10 singles in England than even the Stones or the Beatles at one point. So they were very, very successful over there. And continue to do so today. Yeah. I mean, they keep touring and selling out shows.
They're legendary. They're like the Zeppelins. Yeah. Absolutely.
If you look at the numbers, and it's been a while since I have, if you look at the numbers sold as far as singles, and it's staggering what they've sold and how many hits they've had through the years.
Yeah, absolutely. And Martin, in Canada, because I'll get to this later, when I actually saw the band live with my buddy Craig Williams, who was actually going to be a part of this. If someone were to drop out, he's a huge Quo fan as well. But he and I went to see them. What was it? When did they come into town?
2003, 2004.
Yeah, we saw them at the House of Blues, and I think we were the only locals there. Everyone came up from Mexico. It was and Mexico, Canada, and England.
Many people from Mexico.
It was insane.
Which House of Blues did you go to?
We went to the Orange County one, the Disney. Yeah.
Okay, I was at the night before. I was at the
LA,
Sunset Strip.
and it was the same thing there, huh?
Yeah.
I couldn't believe it. I'm going, what's going on? And in fact, the lady, when we bought tickets, we're seeing some place, she goes, oh, some band from Mexico is playing.
I went to see him in Chicago, and it was a fantastic experience because I actually got there early, and I got their name of the road manager ahead of time and asked for him. And he took me backstage, and we got to have dinner with the band, we got to spend the entire evening. We got to see the sound check, and then had VIP. He gave us VIP. It was in Chicago. There was,
club, wasn't it?
It was the House of Blues in Chicago.
Okay.
Now, Martin, were they? Because, like I said, there were a lot of people that came down from Canada, from Vancouver, to see. Because Status Quo. This was like the first time they played since the early '70s, I think, in the U.S. So people came from all over the place to see them in a small club. Yeah. So I'm figuring they must have had a pretty big impact in Canada. Did they when you were younger?
Well, yeah. The funny thing with Canada is that they were on A&M, and basically, there's this kind of myth that's probably true that everybody on A&M in Canada did quite well. Supertramp, Styx, Quo. I mean, Quo, I don't think they have any gold records or anything up here, but they probably had a slightly larger presence here just simply by, the distribution across a pretty challenging country like Canada. I mean, basically every record store would have Quo records in it because A&M, like I say, did a pretty good job. And just to compare notes on seeing them, I mean, I've seen them twice, and both times were here in Toronto in the 2000s. One was in a small club and one was in a large club. The large club was earlier. The small club was about 10 years later. And like you say, I mean, the whole thing, that topic comes up, it rankled them much earlier, for longer, much earlier, that they could never break America. And then later they just got kind of resigned to it. But I just remember when they played the small club, I mean, I think Francis remarked to me, he said, we just played Wembley 2 days ago to 80,000 people or something like that, right?
Yeah.
So it was crazy, but basically they were playing like a small hard rock cafe that fit about 250, 300, and it was glorious. I mean, just incredible sound and just a great band. But
That's great.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was like the House of Blues about the size. And it was funny because people were saying, like, I was talking to a lot of people that came up from Mexico City, and they said they did 2 nights at a giant bullfighting stadium in Mexico City.
right.
I mean, every country apart from the U.S., they're like massive.
When Quo got to Mexico, because I've read a lot about that show, Quo were shocked how popular they were in Mexico, to the point where even the bootleg merchandise, the Quo crew and the Quo members bought a lot of stuff because it was such good quality merchandise. Huge band in Mexico. And as far as Canada goes, I think they got the Canadian crowd on their side from always going over there on tour. In the mid to late 70s and throughout the years, they always hit Canada.
Yeah.
Montreal, Toronto.
Nice.
Yeah.
Well, let's go through because they have quite an extensive catalog. So we're going to kind of, Martin, you could help me along to kind of speed this through. But let's get started. A lot of people don't know about Quo's history. In fact, I didn't realize until, a few years. Well, I remember about Pictures of Matchstick Men, the song. But, 1968, we're talking the same year that, the Deep Purple came out. Yeah. With the Shades of Deep Purple and, a Sabbath. They're just prior to their debut album and Zeppelin's debut. So they were around for a long time. Picturesque, matchstickable messages from the status quo.
Which is interesting because by the time this album came out, they'd already been around for a while. And Trivia, what was their first name when they first got back together?
Trivia? Well, they were first they were the Spectres and then Traffic Jam.
Yes, but before then they actually
Quo.
used the name Scorpions at one point.
Oh, that's right.
At the very, very beginning.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And they went by the Status Quo.
Yes.
Around that period.
Were you familiar? Were you aware of that, Martin?
No, absolutely not. I mean, I just looked up on Wiki that said that they literally started as far back as 62, right?
Oh, yeah, they did. What was nice about that period, that album you're talking about, Bob, is it was more psychedelic.
Yeah, I noticed that.
Very much so. And they had a record producer which produced Mark Kelly's Greasy Spoon as well, and Dog a Two Head. He was Pi Records record producer, John Schroeder, and he influenced the band in many ways to dress psychedelic, to sound psychedelic, even down to telling Rick Parfitt, who did quite a few lead vocals, to sound like Robin Gibb of the Bee Gees.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
And he does a great job vocals.
They actually did a Bee Gees song in one of their early albums.
Yeah.
Was it Ice in the Sun?
They did Ice in the Sun, Spicks and Specks.
Yeah.
Great Green Tambourine they do on that one. That's a great album.
Yeah.
Well, I guess
Flat.
considering 60s, that was a psychedelic era still. Even in Britain, they were going through a lot of...
It fit the times. It fit the
rock.
times. And of course, the signature song, Pictures of Matchstick Men, was the signature song that ultimately came out. Originally issued as a B-side, but then when it got flipped and became the big hit, that if there's one song that Americans do know, they have no idea who it's by, who wrote it, or when it came out, but almost everybody recognizes that psychedelic riff of Pictures of Matchstick Men.
Oh, it's a great riff.
Well, you know what really kind of broke that? A lot of people thought when Ozzy redid in some album in the 90s, I think.
Ozzy covered it, yes.
Yeah, and then it became pretty big.
That.
That was like when people were like, who is this?
Yeah.
Martin, what's your thoughts on the debut album?
I really don't know it that well, but it is a psych record. It's right in there, August 68, right? I mean, just kind of like Pink Floyd started out psych. It was good to see them in there. So there's these perennial albums that it's cool that's there, but then they move on pretty quickly and move on to the British blues boom era, right?
They do.
Yeah.
I mean, the second album, Spare Parts, was very similar, kind of a follow-up. Didn't quite yield the hits that they were hoping for, and maybe that's what kind of triggered a little bit of change in direction when they moved into that third album, which Mark Kelly's Greasy Spoon. One of my favorite Quo albums, by the way, when they kind of adopted a much more bluesier, heavier style that seemed to kind of go along with maybe what bands like Fleetwood Mac were starting to do at the time, right? So they were heading in that same direction. I mean, Spinning Wheel Blues and songs like that are just awesome. They became signature songs in their live set as well.
Oh, great period for Quo is that period.
That was 1970. Mark Kelly's Greasy Spoon. That's kind of where they came into their own in a way.
And that's where they got rid of all of the psychedelic sound, the clothes, just wore sort of dirty old jeans, T-shirts. And,
now, where did the boogie aspect come by? Because that's kind of a southern boogie almost, and you had a lot of British bands that were kind of course, they were copying the old blues, the American blues, but that kind of had that southern boogie-ish.
We're jumping a little ahead, but if anything, it was the Pile Driver album that kind of created that signature sound for the 70s. Dog of Two Head was kind of similar as the Spare Parts album, was more of a follow-up to Mark Kelly's Greasy Spoon. But it was Pile Driver that was kind of like the turning point. Mick, do you agree?
Without a doubt. But back to those Mark Kelly, Greasy Spoon, and Dog of Two Head, great period for Quo, just gritty and raw. The influences definitely came from American blues and that kind of stuff, but there was a lot of that kind of stuff going on in England, like Canned Heat,
Savoy Brown,
exactly.
So Foghat, of course.
Yeah. If anything, the very first taste of the boogie kind of style was on Mean Girl, right? There was a single that came out on the Dog of Two Head album, which kind of signaled as to the direction they're going to go, and it was not a huge hit, but it was a solid hit for them back in the time.
Martin, what were your thoughts on Mark Kelly's Greasy Spoon, Dog of Two Heads?
I had to go back and get those because the first one I ever got was Pile Driver, because that is the first one that came out in Canada. I don't think those other ones ever came out in Canada. So, those transitional albums, when I went back and got them, I remember the very first Quo I ever got was a compilation called Golden Hour of Status Quo. Right? Now, I can't remember if I got that before Pile Driver or after. I got Pile Driver almost as a new release at, 9 years old, 10 years old?
Okay.
It was pretty darn early. It was one of the very first records I ever got. And I mean, who could sort of, resist that basically iconic first headbanger shot, really, on that cover of those guys leaned over with their long hair and the I'm moving forward to Pile Driver, as you can see, but I may as well talk about that now quickly, and then I'll cede the floor back to you guys. But so that was the big turning point for me, because I mean, this whole British blues boom thing I find interesting. Like certain bands, I remember talking to Jim Simpson and how Black Sabbath made that transition, and they basically said we were all getting really bored with the British blues boom. There's just too many rules, too much jamming. There's not much you can do with it. So I always like this idea of these bands that found out how to make the blues interesting for people. And Status Quo certainly like that, because by the time you get to Pile Driver, they're mixing in the slightly more modern heavy metal riffs. And I did an episode of my podcast on the birth of American heavy metal, which I consider to be exactly this idea of making the blues more interesting as you move through Cactus, Mountain, Montrose, Ted Nugent, Aerosmith. That those guys all played a lot of boogie and a lot of blues, but at this even Kiss at the beginning, but infused the heavy metal riffs. So Pile Driver, you had Oh Baby, which didn't feel like a blues song. You had Big Fat Mama, which is exactly this idea of Kiss Strutter with the A-B switch between heavy metal riffs and boogie riffs. Cat Scratch Fever, same thing, A-B switch, right? Between the chorus and the verse. Big Fat Mama, you got this. This is like the first modern Status Quo song. Paper Plane's heavy. You got Roadhouse Blues on that. So yeah, I really come on board big time at Pile Driver. I cede the floor back to you guys.
What I also still sticking to Pile Driver. You mentioned Paper Plane, a heavy song, but it also signaled a little bit of the commercialism that started to creep in a good way. Not in the way that when we get to the 80s and the 90s, but in a good way. Paper Plane, I think, was a terrific song that was a great candidate for a single.
Yeah.
They made it a single. It was successful, but it kind of signaled of some of the hits that were to come through the rest of the 70s.
Yeah, and with, what you said, Martin, about Pile Driver, you sort of first listened to that first and sort of went back into their earlier catalogue. That was the same for me. Because of my age, I was 13 when I bought Pile Driver, so I bought it in 73.
Yeah.
That was the third LP I ever bought in my life. And
Cool.
I bought it because of Paper Plane was on it. I knew that song from being a single, and obviously the cover. I had to buy it because of the cover. I mean, that's a great cover.
And the title.
And the title, without a doubt.
Iconic.
And once I bought that, and I think the next one I bought was Hello, then obviously I wanted to hear what was before that. So I bought the Best Of, which is a combination of the Dog o' Two Heads and Mark Ellis' Greasy Spoon. So it's nice to sort of, be blown away by, let's say, Pile Driver, and then go back to the catalogue to say, okay, where did they get that sound from?
Yeah.
And same with you, John. I think you said, and tell me if I'm wrong, I think you got into Hello first or Pile Driver first.
No, with me, I'm. It seems like I'm the latecomer to this party here compared to you guys. My first song, and it sounds cliche because it's still their biggest signature hit, was Caroline that I heard, and it was on German TV. I was living in Munich at the time. Every other Saturday, they had this show on the second channel in Germany called Disco with Ilya Richter. And there was Status Quo playing Caroline, and I was just blown away. I go, what the fuck is this? This is really cool. And they looked like on the cover of Pile Driver when they performed this. That's when I got into Status Quo, and I thought they just looked so heavy. They had a couple compilation albums out that I started to look into. And I didn't really buy Hello till I moved to America. Caroline came out in 1973, and I moved to America in 1974, and it was one of the very first albums I bought was Hello. Okay. Because it had Caroline on it. That was drove me. But then you had all the other great songs on that, which is still, to me, my favorite album. I know I'm setting the stage maybe early for this, but it is my favorite.
That's okay because it's a fantastic album.
It's interesting for me, living in LA and being American. Like I said, people that are metal experts, so to speak, in America, a lot of these people are hard rock experts. They don't even know of Status Quo. That's how underground they were, especially at this time. And it was probably till the mid to late 70s when the Circus magazines and the Cream magazines would have little blurbs. You remember when Cream started the Cream Metal and all that? And they would have little paragraphs about Status Quo. What was that, about 70, 79, 80? Okay. And they would have, and a lot of people, a lot of the British bands would always quote Status Quo as an influence. I'm like, who is this band? And I would finally see their albums used, and I saw the Pile Driver album. I'm like, God, this looks so heavy. And that is such an iconic photo because you look at Judas Priest, they say, when how KK, Glenn Tipton, and Halford come together and start headbanging. Everyone in England said, oh, that's a Status Quo thing. And, UFO did the same thing with Schenker with just a long hair, going down with Phil Mogg. And, everyone said, oh, that's, the signature Status Quo look. And so I remember buying that album used, thinking it would look so cool and heavy, and just disappointed because I thought it was going to be like this, Black Sabbath, super heavy kind of thing.
In some ways, Status Quo are like Motorhead. I mean, Lemmy never thought he was a metal guy or Motorhead was a heavy metal band. They were a rock and roll band, right? And that Status Quo are kind of the same way. They were just a heavy rock and roll band. I don't think they ever consider themselves as metal. And
no. And, definitely not.
And they shouldn't be because they're really not. Well, yes, they had the hair, they had the headbanging, they had all of that, but really, it wasn't a metal band. It was just a heavy rock
absolutely,
band.
Yeah. It was a boogie band.
Yeah.
Martin, anything else on the Pile Driver, or before we get into Hello? Or
well, okay. I mean, I'll comment a little more on Pile Driver, but quickly move into Hello. Then I'll start that one off if you want. But I mean, I love that idea that Paper Plane brought in the pop, because basically it's a pile driving boogie tune mixed with a bit of pop. Big Fat Mama's a pile driving boogie tune mixed with metal. Yeah. Oh Baby is like, that really pleased the metalheads because it was pretty much a doom tune. It didn't have too many of the boogie rules at all. And just to reiterate, what I like about Quo at this point is this idea about making the blues interesting. What they did more so, they were making 50s rock and roll interesting. It wasn't so much the blues. Zeppelin kind of made the blues mixed with folk and folky blues interesting, and other bands kind of went down that route. But there weren't too many that were going back to original, rock and roll, like the Mods and the Rockers kind of thing, and trying to make that 50s music, that sped up blues interesting, and that's what was cool about Quo, I think, for the metalheads. It was just a little faster. Plus, they were mixing in that stuff. to throw in Hello, I won't say much on Hello because I'm much more passionate moving forward, but Hello, I was not that crazy about it. And as I look at the track listing, really very few of these songs grabbed me in a big way. To me, the three songs stood out so much on Piledriver that nothing really stands out here. Hello was more of like this median average album throughout. It had kind of everything was kind of squashed into this middle zone that I didn't feel anything just stuck out big times, other than maybe 4,500 times. Caroline as well. No, it's probably my least favorite of the next. Let's see, of these, starting with Piledriver, I'd say of the next, of the six combined, it's my least favorite.
Okay.
Roll Over, Lay Down, you didn't care for that? That's one of my favorite tunes, that and Caroline. I mean, that just the riff in that, it's just such a energetic boogie riff.
And you had the melodious nature of like songs like Claude. I mean, they brought in some pretty interesting melodies as well.
Oh, yeah.
I love that album. But again, it was a segue into the next album, which is Quo, and to me, I think that's probably the heaviest album.
Well,
I would say the next one.
It is very heavy, and what I like about that album is when you try to figure it out on guitar, you realise how good of a guitarist Rossi is and Parfit. I mean, it's a very good album if you try to figure out the songs, where the songs are going.
Yeah.
Softer Ride, always loved that song. Tried to learn that when I was a kid. Had trouble doing it. Claudie, very country-sounding song. I mean, Reason for Living, love that one. I think that's a very strong album. Has it been a while since you've listened to that, Martin?
No, I've got all four of these on my iTunes, on my two different iPods, so I played them a lot.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, moving forward, if are we done on Hello, and I'll move forward to Quo.
Let's start with Quo.
So Quo to me is an absolute masterpiece. It's my favorite Quo album. I just think that Backwater Just Take Me thing is the most explosive, most joyous expression of boogie transcendence and bliss by anybody anywhere. The other band I always compare to Status Quo is Foghat, and they have certain transcendent moments too, but I've never heard anything as transcendent as Backwater Just Take Me. And I love the heavy metal of Drifting Away. I love Slow Train with that really pulsing boogie sound like a train. Don't think it matters. So Quo to me is just a masterpiece start to finish. I love the poppy mellow moments on it because it's just a masterful record of sequencing too. The Holy Grail, I always think, I would love to see if I could find a live version that could rival the studio version. And I found one once. It was an outdoor one on YouTube, and I could never find it again, but I've played 10 or 12 or 15 other versions live, and nothing ever can compete with the studio version. It's just so brilliant the way they did that, with that slight speeding up aspect and that counterpoint guitar in the backwater, going back and forth. I just think it's a brilliant album, and the reason I love Quo so much.
Right. And I'm not disagreeing with you, Martin. It is a fantastic album, and maybe the reason I'm preferring Hello is because of the nostalgia. Because it was where I got introduced to Quo, to Status Quo as a band. But Quo was the very next album that I did buy them, and they were only a couple of weeks apart, because when I bought Hello, it's already been out for a while, and Quo just came out at the time. So those were two albums that I was just listening to as a 14, 15-year-old all the time. Yeah. Probably my two most played albums. But you're right, Backwater, Just Take Me, Drifting Away, Don't Think It Matters. It's just such a cool driving song. It just doesn't stop, right? Slow Train, all of that, classics.
Yeah,
I have to agree. That's probably my favourite Quo album, is Quo. Blown away when I first bought it. Saw them around that period in 75, a couple of times in 75 actually. So and they always opened with Backwater back then. And just a bloody good album. The fact that Alan Lancaster wrote several of those tunes and did lead vocals on Backwater, Just Take Me, Drifting Away, Don't Think It Matters.
Very cool, good point.
made a big difference in the sound.
Yeah, great vocals.
He was
for
like
sure.
a heavy guy, right? That really brought the heaviness.
He wanted Quo to be heavy metal.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
that's where the problem became between him and Rossi. Rossi didn't want any part of that.
And that's kind of you're right. At this point, the personalities really started to come out, right?
Yeah.
So you had Alan as the heavy metal guy. You had Rick Parfitt as the heavy rock guy. You had Francis Rossi as kind of the country pop guy, right?
Right.
And then you had the bass player.
Lancaster.
And John Coughlin. I'm sorry, you had John
Coughlin, the
you
drummer.
had John Coughlin, who kind of was the crazy guy, but in the band. But the personalities came out, and which ultimately started to lead to conflicts that happened around the turn of the decade.
And I do think Parfitt would have gone along with Lancaster being heavier and heavier, and that's where I wanted Quo to start. I wanted them to get heavier too.
Yeah.
Great album, Quo.
You it's interesting too, Martin, how you bring up Foghat, because I always bring them up as the band that Quo should have probably been in America, because they were the ones that stole their glory, and that was how it was in America. If you don't conquer America at the time and tour there, I think Foghat slipped in. I mean, obviously Foghat had a bit of a name through Savoy Brown, I would imagine, back in the very early 70s. And then when they came to America, I mean, they just, Foghat Live, I mean, some of those Slow Ride, they had the hits, and they conquered America. And I use it the same way. It's like Sweet and Queen. Queen kind of stole Sweet. I mean, Sweet, before Queen, Sweet were the radio darlings, starting way back in the early 70s with Little Willie. And then, of course, with Fox on the Run and Action and all the other songs that they had. But, they had a lot of big radio hits. But every time they tried to tour, it was kind of a disaster. Same with Thin Lizzy. So that's why people don't realize that. People think that radio was just all about radio bands. But, all those radio bands, BTO, all those bands, they never had the longevity. You had to tour, you had to conquer, you had to prove yourself.
What happened with Quo on the tour side, glad you mentioned it, because what killed them in America was that they were booked on a tour with Fleetwood Mac in the mid-'70s. The problem was that this was the fake Fleetwood Mac.
Oh, right.
And that tour ended up in a disaster, and it set Quo back. I think they were heading in the right direction, but that tour turned out to be such a disaster it set them back. But they kept pushing away. They were getting ready to do the next album, Blue for You, which was another signature record for them, another big success. But it kind of started to already, on the Blue for You album, as much as I like it, it already started to show some of those split personalities.
Oh, yeah.
What was On the Level that came out in between those?
Oh, yeah, let's talk about On the Level, because that probably has what's the biggest hit ever, right? Down, Down. In terms of commercial success,
I think their only hit here in America was "Rock and Roll," "Rockin' All Over the World."
But let's talk about On the Level.
On the Level, great album. Probably my close first favorite album. If it's not the first, it's number 2. I think I love that album, and I think it means so much to me because when I bought it, I bought it when it was first released in '75, and then I did go and see them at London on that tour, and then every song on there is fantastic.
Was this cover? It's got a great cover as well, where everybody looks a different size, right? Through the. Was this a Hypnosis cover? I believe it was, but I'm not 100% sure if it was.
I'm not 100% sure, but it's very, very good cover.
Yeah.
Great album.
It had Down Down, Little Lady, some great songs. No, can't say much more. This was the peak of Quo, right?
Yeah.
This was the peak of the band. Commercial, creative, everything else we want to say applied at this time. From Hello all the way through Blue for You, which I kind of handed on, and we'll get to it a little more in detail in a little bit.
When they were writing on that album, because they had just come off tour of America on the Quo tour in '74, and then they went over to Australia with Slade. So a lot of the songs were written on tour, from what I read. So I kind of think that the sound changed a little bit, because now you've got Rossi doing most of the vocals. You do have Parfitt singing. Let me back up. You got Lancaster doing Bye Bye Johnny. You've got Lancaster doing Broken Man, because he wrote that one. But I hear more of an American sound coming through in that, because they spent
That's true.
a certain amount of time over
here.
here. And now they're trying to break the States, and that was their goal at that point. they really wanted to make it in this country. So again, great guitar work on there.
And I think to back up what you just said, that Trying to Break in America, I think, was their attempt at doing Bye Bye Johnny, as the last song on that album. Very kind of American focused tune. Chuck Berry song, obviously. There were, based on what you said, Martin, earlier, they were trying to make the 50s rock and roll, American rock and roll, more interesting. This was kind of the epitome of that. That's what they were trying to do. It became a solid song in their live set, but it didn't quite achieve the results that they wanted.
Were they pretty big in Canada during this time? Did they tour Canada this year, Martin?
According to Mick, they did, but
They did.
I don't know. I'd never heard of them playing Canada.
Yeah,
So, I mean, but it's not, I was too young to see it, and plus I was out west. It's not that I would know. But I'm surprised to hear that, because I thought the whole idea was that they tried only sporadically in North America, and I always thought that included Canada, but maybe I'm wrong.
I will do more research, but I'm pretty sure by then they'd hit Canada a couple of times. I think they might have even hit Canada on the Quo tour in '74. If they didn't, they definitely went over there. They might not have come to Northern America, but they went to Canada.
It was on the Level tour when they did that disastrous tour with Fleetwood Mac.
Okay.
Yeah, because everybody was expecting Fleetwood Mac just before Fleetwood Mac got their big break with Stevie Nicks and all that. So but it was like the fake Fleetwood Mac with
Okay.
I don't know which one of the guys that just.
Well, you know what? This is probably a few years later. If we're still talking like 75 here. It might have been. I heard, it's funny, I ran into this guy, this was several years ago, wearing a Quo shirt, and I talked to him. I'm like, holy shit, Status Quo. And he was a tour manager back in the 70s, and he said he worked with Quo, he worked with all these bands. And something incidentally that I thought was funny, he says the two biggest party bands you could ever imagine were Status Quo and the Eagles. And I like, you're kidding. I'm thinking, Zeppelin or all these bands. He goes, dude, Zeppelin can't hold a candle to even the Eagles. He said they were fucking insane. And so were Status Quo. And I never realized they were such a big party band. But this was the thing about great live bands there, as you guys could attest in the 70s, it was super competitive. Especially when you're playing with the big bands, the Aerosmiths, the Ted Nugents or whatever. You had to, be aware of, they would turn the lights on you, or they would fuck with your sound. They would do all that. And apparently he said that Quo did like a few shows with Aerosmith, and this one, Aerosmith was in their drug phase. So I imagine it's probably 76, 77. And they were just kicking Aerosmith's ass. And after like 4 or 5 shows, Aerosmith just kicked them off the show. And I heard it was the same thing with Slade, another band that never broke in America because they were so fucking good live. And that was the thing, when you hear these bands on record, and after seeing Quo live, that's when I really became a fan of theirs, because it's like, man, I mean, they are a live band. And people say the same thing about Slade. I mean, everyone was afraid to play with Slade because they knew they'd get blown away. And so these bands, again, in America, if you're opening for us, you better turn it down. So, but are you aware of them ever doing some shows with Aerosmith here in the States?
No, that was kind of under the radar, maybe on the East Coast or something. But
let me chime in there, because I love when you mention live versus studio, because, just to say my piece on this record, if I called Backwater and Just Take Me transcendent, I think the key songs on here almost transcend that, but in a different way, more of a straight, heavy, powerful way. And I think like Little Lady, Down Down, and Bye Bye Johnny on this are just the studio versions. They have to be untouchable. I mean, they are just so pile driving and powerful. I love the way that the mix on this album, everything kind of sits right there in the seething mid-range, and the guys just go for it. So to me, this record, and I love the way that there is some variety, there's some tightening up, there's a little bit of poppiness there. I think a song like Night Ride, which would be my 4th favorite song on here, probably bodes well for the future in terms of them like reconfiguring pop and boogie together, which they do endlessly for the next 15 albums, right? 20 albums. But I think that starts with a song like Night Ride. I do like Most of the Time, which is just a straight heavy blues. I'm not one to like that stuff, and like I say, I needed to find something to make it interesting for me, the blues, and Quo does it that other way, the rock and roll way. But I just really think it's ludicrous to say when you say what's the heaviest thing you've ever heard. Sometimes I say you really can't get any heavier than Pantera, and certain people say you can't get heavier than black metal. But there's a certain kind of magical heaviness in Little Lady and Down Down, certainly, that you just can't get heavier in a certain way than what they're doing there.
Yeah.
So we pretty much touched on Blue for You as well, or is there, you want to let's cap off the 70s because we're going to kind of zip through the 80s and 90s a bit.
Well,
but was there anything else for Blue for You wanted to add?
Before we go into the 80s, Martin loves Quo album so much with Backwater Just Take Me. What do you think of the live album that came out in 77, recorded in 76, which has a lot of those songs on it because it's that period?
Yeah. And that was a transitional album for them because, as we're going to get into in a minute, the sound changed drastically after that record. After the live album, they got an outside producer, and we're going to get into it more. But I think the live album belongs right up there with some of the other classics live albums of the 70s. The Made in Japan's, The Strangers in the Night. It's right up there with it. And because those songs did come across. I do agree with Martin that the production on those classic studio albums was so good and the sound was so perfect that they were almost hard to beat on record. Not saying that if you were in the concert hall at the Apollo, right, where the album was recorded, it wouldn't blow you away. But I don't think it quite captured the power, as weird as it sounds, of the studio albums.
But the energy of the performance was
absolutely.
Yeah, it is a great live album. It's a good track list. There's a lot of songs on it because me, Bob. I mean, my vein is I hate, and you too. Right. We're exactly the same. We hate the rainbow on stage idea, and I don't like Made in Japan for that same reason. But no, I like this and like Rush. That idea of capping off an era, you guys are right. I mean, this record does cap off an era. I'm just pulling up my bits and pieces from it. So I've got a UK one here, but I remember this came out in Canada, and the album cover was slightly different. They changed all the coloring of it between the Vertigo to the A&M. But yeah, it did come out in Canada, and it was a good live record. And if I could just put my little piece in on the next one, I mean, I really loved Blue for You. My copy is just called Status Quo, right? Let's see, what is mine? Mine is American. So I guess this was just called Status Quo in America and Canada. And we got embossed with the gold, with a silver foil embossed Status Quo, and we got the die cut with the hole in the middle, right? And the silver record label. But of course, this one has the Immense Is There a Better Way, their greatest heavy metal song, right?
That's a great tune. Mystery
Song was a great heavy song. Rain was a great heavy song, and I loved That's a Fact. I thought that was really cool.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, this is them. This is essentially kind of similar to the melange, the product mix of On the Level, I imagine.
Yeah, and the title track, Blue for You, at least for the European version, to me that kind of. They were looking back at those Dog Off Two Head days when they kind of recorded that.
Well,
it's got to kind of get that vibe to it.
Yeah. Well, that's Alan Lancaster's influence. He wrote that song, and he sings that song, and Ease Your Mind as well. He wrote that and sings that. So that's his influence there. That's a Fact is a great song. That's a typical Rossi. Rolling Home, always loved that one.
Good stuff.
Great album. Yeah.
They're very similar to, when you talk about the blues, like making the blues more exciting. It's kind of like what AC/DC did in the fact that they could write so many riffs that are just, it's like, how the fuck do they come up? Very simple, very bluesy, boogie kind of riffs, but so genius. It's like, fuck, how did they come up with that? And they are able to do that for many years. And I think those early 70s Quo album, whether you like the band or not, or whether you like the booginess or not, it's just like such clever original riffs.
Very clever.
Wow. Yeah.
And you can tell it's Quo. They've got their sound. They put their stamp on it.
So now we are post-live album. And Rockin' All Over the World. Huge change for them. Outside producer for the first time.
Yep.
Much more slick. Kind of fit in that late 70s when, bands, kind of anti-punk record, right? And kind of more with some of those more polished bands that were out around the time.
I think that was their first, kind of, like I said before, their first kind of, it wasn't even a radio hit in the States, but the only time they ever got radio play that I was aware of in the U.S. or at least in California. Was that a big record in Canada, Martin? The Rockin' All Over the World?
I remember it as being that much of a big deal. I mean, I'm looking at my copy here, and my copy is it's a Canadian copy, but hang on, or is it America? They're on Capitol at this point. They changed their label at this point, right? Yeah. So they've changed labels, and you're right. Pip Williams is producing. I mean, my kind of feeling on this record is it did start going downhill for me. I was not that big a fan, but I learned to love it a lot later, and actually probably very close. Top 5 Quo songs for me of all time is Too Far Gone.
Yes.
Great love it.
Yeah.
I love Dirty Water on here. I love the title track, Rockin' All Over the World. Very charming. Hard Time is charming. But yeah, you guys are right. I mean, it is a little tighter. It's a little dressier. But also casual and, like I say, charming at the same time. It's almost like you might argue that the songwriting is just a little better on it, right?
It seems like they put thought into this album. And, you know, in many ways, the way I feel about the 70s, that a lot of the greatest songs were written without thought. You know, it's kind of an impulse, maybe some influence from drugs, all this kind of stuff. This seemed a little bit more strategic, this album. They gave some thought into it. Pip Williams obviously had an influence on them just because the sound is just so drastically different here. But it still had the core elements. I mean, like you said, Too Far Gone is an amazing song. Maybe this was the album when they thought about, hey, now or never when it comes to America.
I think so too. I think that this is where they realized, and I'm talking more Rossi than probably the others, but this is where they needed to evolve, I think. And if this is the album that could break America, especially with the John Fogerty influence, Rockin' All Over the World title track. There's a reason why they chose a Fogerty song. I think they were really trying.
That's a Fogerty song.
Yes. Yeah.
Oh wow, I didn't even know that.
And they've done another one as well, which I've gone blank, but I'll think of that one in a minute. But I think this was the time that, hey, if we're going to break America, we need to soften our sound up, change our writing style a bit, and rightly so. I mean, they have to evolve. Any band has to
Something
evolve.
you said interesting too, John, is this is during the punk explosion in the UK, and they were one of the bands that were anti-punk. And if you remember back then, hard rock and metal, there were very few bands that were able to sustain that, to do what they do. A lot of bands are starting to change, but so it would be the perfect time for them to come to America.
Yeah.
And it was a strange time in England for music. It really was. You could either get left behind, or you have to sort of change your style, or you don't. You can stay the same, but it's a gamble. But I think Rossi, he's got that in him anyway. He wants to always evolve musically and get better, and I think by now their songwriting has they've got the chemistry down, and I think they are just evolving.
Yep.
Great album.
Yeah.
All right. So should we combine
Well, if you can't stand the heat, to me it's kind of like we mentioned before, and so many bands have a signature album like Rocking All Over the World did become for them. And they were trying to follow that up, right? They were almost trying to duplicate it. I don't think they succeeded as much with If You Can't Stand the Heat. It has its share of decent songs, but to me, this is when I think that they realized that they didn't really quite succeed in America like they hoped for, and they tried it again, but it seemed a little forced to me when it comes to If You Can't Stand the Heat. Mick,
Well, again, I think you've got influence because the sound now is getting more as far as the studio mix and whatever, because, again, Pip Williams is the producer. I think they have really are changing their sound now because they've added horns on... what is it?
on And Again and Again.
Yeah. Again, I think looking back and putting it on now versus when it first came out, I appreciate it more now than I did.
Yeah, and it was probably if you're looking back to that point, the least of the heavy albums, because if you notice, Rick Parfitt only wrote one song on the entire album, and he was like the heavy rock guy.
Was Lancaster out of the band at this time?
No.
It was still the original four. but it started to show that Francis Rossi seemed to have taken more and more control of the band and the sound.
What are your thoughts, Martin?
Okay, here's where I have to ask you guys, because I'm dying to know, because I really should spend a lot more time with these records. I own most of these 80s records and some of the 90s, but I've almost nothing to say on any of them except for Whatever You Want, which I quite like. We have the different title and the different cover. I like Living on an Island, etc. But all of this stuff, I have nothing to say on any of these records, even though I own them. So I really want to ask you guys, what would be the one or two total go-to albums that you think is a classic from the 80s?
Well, right now we're at 78 on If You Can't Stand the Heat. So you want to talk 80s or stick with...
Sure, I mean, from here forward.
These are important albums for Quo, I think, because their songwriting is definitely, I think, getting better, even though when I first bought this in 78, I wasn't that keen because I wanted the signature Quo sound. Well, there's many albums that had that, but I still wanted that. I think this was the time where they did need to change their sound, and they did. So again and again, I liked that song as soon as I heard it. Some of the other ones, I like them a lot now. I think I recommend listening to them again, Martin, because
I do.
I think you'll have a completely different opinion.
No, I agree. I think that if you look at Rockin' All Over the World and If You Can't Stand the Heat, they kind of were the same kind of albums as Dog of Two Head and Mark Kelly were a decade earlier, right? They were those transitional albums that set the stage for the next few years. You know, Whatever You Want, to me, is another great album. To me, this is when it all kind of came together, even more so what they tried to do on If You Can't Stand the Heat. They succeeded on Whatever You Want. The title track and Living on an Island are just superb songwriting songs. I mean, any songwriter would be proud of those. Rick Parfitt started to get a little more involved. It was still produced by Pip Williams, so it still had that clean studio
Very
sound.
clean, yeah.
But the songs were just so well written on that album. So to me, post of that heavy classic era, Whatever You Want is a standout. And I know we're still in 79, Martin, but I think that album, I would almost group it into those 80s albums.
I think these late 70 albums are very important albums for Quo. Before they hit the 80s. And listening back, because I listened to these recently with headphones, like Stones, written by Lancaster, great song. I really do think you should listen to them again. They are really good.
I mean, it's funny, guys. I'm sitting here on my lap. I've got like vinyl copies of 1982, If You Can't Stand the Heat, Never Too Late, Just Supposin', back to back, Ain't Complaining, and In the Army Now, and I know nothing about it.
They're all good albums. They're all good albums.
In the Army Now has got to be their worst song ever.
They're good albums, and we can group some of these together. All of these albums are good. I would never, ever say that they wrote a bad album. Well, there's a couple that I might be leaning to saying, why did they do these? But these early 80s albums, I mean, it really set the stage for their longevity. They've tried something new. They made some changes. They were adventurous. They got another outside producer in John Eden for some of those.
Were they big in England, those albums?
Oh, yeah.
The 80s albums?
They were huge.
Because I know that was the new wave of British heavy metal and all that going on. I didn't know how big they...
But again,
they were huge.
Yeah, they really
I know it's a live
cemented Quo as an institution and set the stage why they were able to put out the new album, Backbone, about 2 months ago. These were the albums that really set their legacy.
I think because at that period I was going back to England for 6 weeks and hitting the festivals and buying the Quo albums that I couldn't find here, because nothing would break my heart more than going into the Record Factory or Tower Records, and there's not even a bloody section for Quo at that time.
Well, I know, these are all imports. Every one of these I have is from England.
Yep. Now,
at
that period over here, you would find, and very often you wouldn't find, you'd find it in the S section.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And that's sad. So when I would go back to England, I would pick up these albums. When they first came out in 78, I went back. 80, I went back. But the great thing about Quo was, even if you weren't that keen on the album when you first bought their brand new release, because the songwriting had changed, their live set was still the same. They were still a rocking band live. They probably did one, maybe two songs off the new album, but they kept their live set. They didn't ever sort of deviate from their live set because it worked.
But are there any of those records that have just the horrific 80s production sound and the big electronic drum sound?
No.
Like, did they ever screw up badly in the 80s?
There are, I mean, again, you have to listen to these albums and you might hear some of the things you're talking about, but it's...
It was not that dominant.
It wasn't Def Leppard.
No, I think they did a bloody good job considering what was going on musically with the punk.
If anything, that 80s sound, if anything, the closest they came to that is with the In the Army Now, and then the follow-up Ain't Complaining. Those two albums, to me, kind of the weak era in the 80s.
Yeah.
But it was never to a point where it sounded like something off of MTV at the time. It never gotten that bad.
No, it didn't get that bad. But if you think about it, look at all the other bands that were changing their styles. That even Priest with
Turbo.
going. Yeah. I mean, I think it's important for a band to try new things, and by having a different record producers like Pip Williams, they're going to influence the band.
Well, Mick and Stred, you were both living in the Bay Area, San Francisco area in the early 80s. Were they known, because I know the Bay Area music scene, they were really into all the different types of metal that even LA, they knew Budgie and all these other bands. You had the state, the Quintana. Was Quo known at all to America?
There was this band in San Jose called Dammaj. And when I first met those guys, they knew of Quo, but that was about
that was probably it, really. I mean,
to be honest, I think it makes.
Were you surprised coming from England, going what? Because Quo are like super.
It was a very sad time in my life because being yanked by my roots to come here at 17, that was leaving my, obviously family, my nan and granddad and friends. Leaving Quo behind was a huge deal to me, and I felt isolated, and I'm sure you did too, John. I felt isolated because they were unknown here, and you felt completely isolated to the point where when they came on tour for Rockin' All Over the World in 77, I picked up the newspaper, probably the Pink section, and came to find out, Quo were playing tonight at Winterland? I didn't know anything about the tour coming up, so it was sad.
There's no press, nothing around them,
And, the times that I did find an album at the record shops, and I would look every single time to see if I could find one, there was some times when I found them, you just felt isolated.
Yeah.
But a great period for Quo, it really was.
So now that we're in the 80s, and I know we talked a lot about Whatever You Want, great album. Just Supposing, still another good one. After that, they still had a couple more that were good. Oh,
well, what they did here is they went into the studio in, I think it was Dublin, Ireland, and recorded 2 albums in one session. So they recorded in 1980 Just Supposing, and then
back to back.
No, it was the Never Too Late album.
Never Too Late.
And so both of those albums, I think, are very good. What are your thoughts?
And that's 80-81, right?
Yeah. Well, Never Too Late came out in 81, but they were both recorded under the same.
To me, I liked them. Again, I was such a huge Quo fan that they could do no wrong. But to me, they were more pop rock albums.
Sure.
Not heavy rock albums. Definitely not heavy metal albums.
No.
They were just pop rock albums, and they kind of continued throughout the 80s. The epitome of the 80s sound to me, when they try to almost appease and reach out to the hair metal band kind of audience with the album that came after Ain't Complaining, the Perfect Remedy album, which to me was probably the low point in the 80s.
And that was 89. That was at the peak of the hair metal era. Martin, were you Quo? Did you see them back when they played Canada then on the Rockin' All Over the World?
Absolutely off my radar this whole time. I mean, I was not getting into these albums, even though, like I say, I was slowly picking them up along the way, but just never really kind of ingesting them. I was onto all sorts of other different kinds of music, and I mean, it's funny. I went to play a few of these earlier today, and Spotify is missing this whole period too. None of this stuff's on Spotify.
Well, it wasn't released in America. Like you said.
We forgot to mention one key piece that happened in the early 80s is when the first big lineup change happened.
Well,
You know.
that's down the road. That's after here.
That's in 1982, right? By the way, that album title has a special meaning, right? 1 + 9 + 8 + 2 added up to 20, which celebrated the 20th anniversary as a band, right? They were formed in 1962, but it was around that time that the Cracks appeared in the lineup, and that kind of set the stage for those later 80s albums as well.
I have to agree, but it was in the recording session of these two albums, and I think it was Never Too Late, where John Coghlan walked out the studio and left the band.
Yeah.
So definitely something was going on internally with personalities, and it was definitely, from what I read, because of the direction musically that they were going. I mean, looking back, I could see why they went that way, with still the punk going on. I mean, there was the heavy metal now was going on in 80, new wave of British heavy metal. They didn't want to go that way.
Right.
Lancaster did, but Rossi certainly didn't.
Yeah, and after John Coghlan left, Rossi wasn't too far behind.
And
I'm sorry, Lancaster wasn't too far
Now, you got to
behind.
tell the story about the video, Rockin' All Over the World video. What was the story? Lancaster was in like Australia on vacation, and then they call him up, say, "Hey, we're shooting a video." He's like, "Fuck you guys, I'm on vacation." Then they say, "We'll do the video without you," and they end up using a blow up doll. Is there truth to that? Or
without a doubt.
Yeah.
Now that's a bit later on, and I think by then he had moved there,
right?
Because they
I
toured
love
over
that.
there quite a bit.
That's
Keep
so
in mind,
Spinal Tap.
Live Aid was in 85,
Right.
they opened up. At this time there were also
That's right. That was 85 by the
there
time.
were also what's his name, Prince Charles. He was like the biggest famous Quo fan.
Oh, really?
Prince Charles
I
was
didn't
a
know
huge
that.
Status Quo fan.
yeah.
He was instrumental in getting them to open Live Aid in London.
Okay.
Right,
Well, they used to do the
Live Aid,
Prince's Trust every year,
Yes,
which was a
yes,
charity.
yes.
But that's further up the road. Back to 1980, which music was kind of.
was changing.
It certainly was. But the interesting thing about both of these albums, Quo co-produced these two albums with John Eden. It was their choice. They weren't getting pushed in a direction musically. I think it was their choice to go that way. Yes, Lancaster wasn't happy, and that, I think, was the ultimate reason why he left. But, he was still writing songs like right here, Mountain Lady, Lancaster, Don't Stop Me Now, Lancaster Bound.
Is he still active, Lancaster?
Oh, yeah.
What's he doing?
Yeah.
Is he?
He's living in Australia.
Yeah.
And of course we,
Oh, okay. The Bombers.
That was
more
in the 90s.
recently, Status Quo did get together as the original four and did
I remember that.
a couple live records as well as some tours. But
Before Rick
it was
died,
it was a one-off before Rick. Parfitt
So
passed
let's
away.
get into. Let's say we just get into the 90s and come out of the 90s and the 2000s here. We're pretty much done with the 80s, right?
Yeah.
We talked about. Did you want? we talked Perfect Remedy.
I do have to
and-
make a comment about Perfect Remedy because that was again that
1989.
was at the peak of the hair metal band era, right? And they were trying to kind of fit in somehow with their sound without really doing all the hairspray stuff. They were still trying to look like Status Quo, but the sound was very polished, was very clean.
Was it still Pippin producing?
It was Pip Williams produced
Pip
it.
Williams,
This is the album that Mercury decided to release in the States as well.
Which album is this?
Perfect Remedy.
But you're missing a couple of important years here. You've jumped to 89.
Yes, I did.
Back to back, in 83, again, Lancaster is involved in the songwriting. And then 84 is when they did the End of the Road tour.
This was on Back to Back. Margarita Time was a critical song because that pissed off a lot of the
Exactly.
team. It pissed off Alan Lancaster and pissed off even Rick Parfitt wasn't too happy
Well,
with
was
the
it
song.
like country?
It was a
Yes.
very
Yeah.
mellow song. But if you listen to it now, it's
Was
a
he trying to
great
do
song.
it?
pop song.
Was he trying to do a Jimmy Buffett kind of thing?
Sure,
Is
yes,
that- is that what-
yes,
yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
See, I think that was the problem with a lot of the British bands. They tried too much to be like the American bands during that 80s period. They saw
Saxon
that they
did it
too.
Saxon,
But where they
Tigers
were
of Pantang,
recording-
Diamond Head.
Where they were recording at that time was it was either in the Bahamas
Right.
or the
Yeah.
Canary Islands or Isle of Man or somewhere somewhere off the map.
Any comments about this, Martin?
Well, I mean, one thing that strikes me is just remembering that period. It almost felt to us that Quo was trying to be comedic and almost a bit of a novelty band, or at least the hits that would come out sounded kind of novelty-ish.
Sure.
I mean, it sounds like they're trying to retain the boogie, but trying to combine it errantly perhaps with new wave or with pop, or just trying to figure out, okay, we desperately want to hang on to this boogie pulse in everything, but we want to combine it with a bunch of different things at the time, and it all just came off as kind of lighthearted. I don't know.
Right. Well, speaking of that, I believe, you talk about comedic. I believe Spinal Tap, a lot of that was based on Status Quo. Status Quo, Black Sabbath, of course, with the Stonehenge, parts of Saxon, but I believe it was a roadie that worked for these bands, and a lot of the movie, most of it was based on Status Quo, from what I understand. And then you have the other, the British band, the Bad News, too, that, did the whole Castle Donington thing, and that was... they were big, Quo guys as well.
Yeah. It's definitely, musically, they've definitely really changed now, and they're getting more mellow at times. And 84 is when they did the End of the Road tour. Yeah. Lancaster left after that, moved to Australia, and that was the period where you said about them doing that
video.
Yeah, and I think it was actually Margarita Time that they did the video on top of the Pops.
Okay.
Yes.
It was like a puppet.
I know you. Strings. Yeah, you used. Well, they actually had that on Rockin' All Over the World too, but you can't find that on YouTube anymore. It was like a giant puppet on strings, and then the camera would just flash by it and look like him. They dressed them up to make them look like him.
Nick and John, I want to ask you. I mean, do you think they were influenced at all or inspired by the other big hometown band, Queen, in terms of just being creative bravery? Like, just, hey, we can do anything. Let's try anything.
I think Rossi, even now, some of the songs that he comes up with now, he definitely wants change in different songs. Without a doubt, it was influenced by Rossi. But looking back at them now and listening to them now, they're all great songs. He's a great songwriter. He's got a formula, and it works. And sure, Queen were changing drastically too. So why not? Sure, he's lost a lot of heavy duty fans here, but he's gaining a lot too. They're getting a lot of airplay. They're very commercial sounding. They're getting airplay a lot now. They're getting
in England.
In England. But the hits kept coming. I mean, the hits, the singles. Despite being so different from what they did in the 70s, were all top 10.
Because now it's not just about the young kids fans. It's like, people in their 50s, 60s, they're getting a huge audience now. When they did the End of the Road tour in 84 and then called it quits, by then Lancaster was living in Australia. 85 was Live Aid. Mm-hmm. They weren't a band. They just put that together, and that's what they only did. 3 songs, opened up the show.
That could have really broke them in America, because that's when people were finally discovered them.
America saw them on TV, because I remember watching it live.
Who is this band? Status Quo.
And 85 they did nothing. Yeah. When I went back in 86 to England, I was there one day and realised Quo were playing. I didn't even know they were playing.
Where'd they play?
They played Nebworth Festival.
Oh, okay.
So I picked up a ticket. Went to Nebworth, left my wife at home in bed sick with the flu, went to Nebworth, and that was the In the Army Now album in 86. Rolling Home, bloody good song.
Yes.
Now, John David wrote that, but a great rocking song.
And the key thing here is that this was the first album recorded with that new lineup that...
Exactly.
That it was just Francis Ross and Rick Parfitt plus 3 new guys.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. And the bass player came from, who's that one that did something Irene?
Dixie's.
Yeah, he came from
there.
You're
kidding.
Oh, yeah. Now, very good drummer. Jeff Rich, excellent drummer. So this is a completely different period now for Quo.
We're talking 1986.
The bass player's still with them. Andy Bown is still with them.
Yep.
That's a very good album. Now, you said you didn't like In the Army Now song. Listen to it again.
Yeah.
Put headphones on and listen to it. It's a bloody powerful song.
Yeah.
Well,
the production of all these
very,
albums was awesome. I mean, that's one thing that never skipped on is they always the sound was always perfect.
I agree
on these
that.
albums.
Yeah.
Fitting to the style.
You
of
agree
the
with that,
songwriting.
Martin? I know you're a big production geek when it comes to production. You think? That
I mean, these moving forward. I mean, I think I have maybe stronger views on the more recent albums, but I mean, I feel like there's this ceiling of heaviness. I mean, it may be perfect for what they're doing, but not even if you wrote a heavy song during this period, it wasn't ever going to sound heavy because these productions were never going to be super heavy.
But keep in mind, Martin, they don't want to be heavy.
Right.
Yeah.
That's the one thing they don't want to be heavy. Now, Parfit probably does. They've got heavy sounding drums.
And Lancaster's out by now, right?
Lancaster's
So,
out.
yeah.
But the cool thing, and like I said it earlier in this podcast, I saw them in '86 on that tour. Even though the album may sound kind of poppy and commercial and, overproduced, their live set in '86 was bloody rocking.
Yeah.
So it's like two bands, one live and one putting out records, and has been that way for a few years now.
Yeah. Let's. We're already over an hour in. Let's well over an hour in. Let's really touch on some of the '90s. We're already into. I guess "Rock Until You Drop" came out in '91. "Rock Till You Drop," I should say. And let's just touch through those through the 2000s.
"Rock Till You Drop" is an interesting album because when you first look at it, if you were to pick this up in a record store, I think it's a live album, but it's not. It actually was trying to. It was an unfocused album for me. Not a bad record, but not very focused. It had some heavy songs, had some of the poppy songs. Things just, to me, didn't flow on this record.
16 songs on that record?
That was the era when CDs just were at their peak, when everybody wanted to cram as much stuff on them as possible. The title track is a relatively heavy tune, but to me, this was the weak era for Status Quo, starting with the Perfect Remedy prior to that. But "Rock Till You Drop's an unfocused record.
Well, that's where they did the "Rock Till You Drop" tour. So they did, I want to say, 5 dates in Scotland, I think 1 or 2 in Scotland, and then Northern England, working all the way down to London, and then Southern England. They did 5 shows in one day.
Yeah.
And that's why it was called the Rock. Yeah, oh yeah.
That's crazy.
And each venue had the gear all set up ready to go, so they would helicopter different places and... that
was a good payday for them, I'm sure.
Well, music business, I'm sure, before there, is changing drastically. I don't know. It's
got to be a record.
Time.
5 shows in one day.
Yeah,
Damn.
I was over in England in '91 at that time, and I picked up the "Rock Till You Drop" record, and then I saw it on TV. They did a live show from those 5 shows while I was there.
The thing about this album cover, and I mentioned it almost looked like it's a live album, but it also was a telling album cover that it only showed Rossi and Parfit on the cover. And at this point, that was Status Quo.
Yeah, that's what people know.
That was Quo. It was these two guys.
But the fan base, just like Queen, the fan base wanted Quo, because Quo have always been a live band. Always been a live band. Even though they put so many records out, it's always been about working as a live band. Like you said about Lizzie and Saxon.
Sure. Yeah.
Some bands are just live bands.
Yeah.
Moving on, to me, in 1994, that was the absolute low point for Status Quo, for me. And it was it was a Thirsty Work album. Even Wikipedia classifies this as power pop.
Well,
don't
listen to
whether
Wikipedia,
that's right or wrong.
know?
That's right.
Let's hear what Mick has to say. I know he'll defend him on
Mick,
this.
Mick, I know, believes that the 90s were an important period, and maybe they were, because it did continue to cement their
Were they popular then? Were these big albums?
Yeah, huge albums.
And they did well.
The fans stuck by them then, pretty much.
Sure. I don't know if they're
or were they gaining new fans? Or?
Oh, without a doubt.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I mean,
still are to this day.
If I look at the song listing honestly, I don't even remember. None of the songs stand out. It was one of those albums that you play and it says, okay, why even bother?
Well, what I like to do, and I think everyone should do this, we've got so many records and CDs and cassettes, and I think it's great to not only just put your favourite ones on, go back and listen to ones that you haven't listened to in years, or listen to some that you've never listened to. I mean, I've never listened to Iron Maiden's Something Souls. Mm-hmm. I think it's still in the wrapper. That's ridiculous, really. I need to pull it out of the bloody wrapper and listen to it. Mm-hmm. So I recommend that we all go back to these periods. And I'm not disagreeing with you, John. It's probably a weak album as far as a Quo album goes. But there's some very good songs on here. Now, keep in mind here, look, John David comes up again. Mm-hmm. Bound wrote David Frost, working with Rossi still. Rossi
and Jennifer Warren's a cover.
Yes, there's some weak songs, but there's some very, very well-written songs. Listen to Sorry, the last song on that album. It's a really good song. Really good song.
Quick point. One thing I always liked found interesting was that Foghat did exactly what Quo did. I mean, as soon as you hit 1980 and Tight Shoes and Girls to Chat,
that's a good point. Yeah.
You got basically those three albums as they go off into the sunset. They do exactly what Quo does, right?
And
a lot of bands
this
did that
is where
from the
Quo
70s.
succeeded, right? They didn't go off into the sunset.
Yeah.
They did make these adventurous changes, and they survived the period, right?
Yeah.
And came out pretty strong in the 2000s. And I know because of time, there were such albums as Under the Influence. And
Now, Heavy
Famous in the
Traffic
Last
was kind of a
Century.
comeback in a way,
That's
right?
exactly where I was going. Heavy Traffic was a return to form for me. That
Right.
was an amazing record that I'm still playing on a regular basis. This is also when they were touring those House of Blues,
Right.
Exactly.
around the U.S. It was a great record. Love it from start to finish.
Live,
And
I mean,
it
it
kind
was
of
so
set
good.
the stage for them being still active today, even though now that Rick Parfitt has passed, that they have a new album out in Backbone that is actually quite a great record.
Yeah. Well, what made Heavy Traffic so good is leading up to, because we were at 94, Thirsty Work. Now they're starting to do like
cover
covers.
albums.
So
Yeah.
a Beach Boys song, Fun, Fun.
Right.
They do Chuck Berry. They do Proud Mary. They do and a lot of people don't want to hear them do that.
A Bob Seger album.
All Around My Hat by that Irish band.
Yeah.
But if you go back and listen to this Don't Stop album in 96, because I bought that when I was over in England in 96, it's a very, very good album. They do these covers very, very well. They really do. Same with Famous in the Last Century.
More covers.
More covers. They do them
Well,
well.
a lot of bands started doing that. I mean, Rod Stewart did all those cover songs at the end. And a lot of these older bands from that day, I don't know if they kind of run out of material
Sure
to write.
they
Or
do. They're stuck in their career.
Yeah.
But the funny thing about these are, to me, some of these songs I couldn't stand by the originals.
Right.
They just weren't my cup of tea.
The Quo could do no wrong to Mick.
No, but if you listen to Sweet Home Chicago, now they rock that one live because they did that on the Heavy Traffic tour. Yeah. So what makes Heavy Traffic so excellent is because now that's finally...
It's going through the book here.
It's finally a new album by Quo that's original, and it was a bloody good album.
And it was a heavy record. I mean, they had some really good heavy songs on this thing.
And I think they needed to, and obviously the record company pushed them into doing the cover songs, and even the management pushed them into doing the cover songs. It was a smart choice.
Keeps
on
them
their
relevant,
part.
sure.
Well, without a doubt, it does.
Martin, what was your thoughts on the Heavy Traffic album in particular?
I love it, and basically I think what I also like is that I think the studio albums now essentially have the same sort of sound, and what I compare them to is AC/DC during Stiff Upper Lip and Ballbreaker era, where there's this ceiling of heaviness, but they've gotten into this comfortable zone where the arrangements are simpler, and now they're really thinking hard about how we can be creative using any kind of boogie rock things. I mean, I think they master this idea of mixing the boogie with the pop, but also what they've done is there's no nonsense in the production. They're just good sounding basic rock and roll albums. And again, I mean, I've always thought, that they're just, it almost feels like they're sitting there pulling their hair out, just like AC/DC, trying to figure out what can we do that's different but not too different. And that means just micro little changes all over the place, like just odd songs like Oriental, right? Just weird stuff. But it all sort of fits this new language that they've invented themselves. So AC/DC, those two records are a little bit of the essentially unplugged AC/DC, and these Quo albums are sort of the same thing. I love them. The writing's amazing, but as you guys are saying, they don't want to be a heavy metal band, so there's the ceiling that they put on the thing. But the cool thing is, it's all guitar rock, like start to finish. There's a heaviness there that if just with a couple of changes and then a total change on the production, they could be heavy metal albums, right? These songs could rock as hard as those classics from the mid-'70s, but they're playing them in a laid-back way. There's a lightheartedness, and then there's just this basicness, not too much distortion to the production. So yeah, In Search of the Fourth Chord and the new one, Backbone, to me, they're all of a suite, and I love that about them. They've got this identity that they absolutely have worked out this secret language that only they know, and they're proving it over and over. And even though necessity had to change the lineup on the last one, I still think it sounds like the previous ones.
Yeah, it does.
They've got their signature sound back, with Heavy Traffic. Now that's the Quo that I think everyone's looking for and have missed all of those years, including the band. Yeah. And I did read, because I do belong to the fan club, Simon Porter, who was the manager at the time with those cover records that they did leading up to the Heavy Traffic, I think they needed to get those out their system. Obviously, it was in their contract and they made some money and got definitely more fans on board. I think they needed to get that out their system, come up with a bloody good album, come over to America and Mexico and Canada and do a great tour for the Heavy Traffic tour, which they did in 2003, and we were all lucky enough to see them.
Yeah.
And that is the turning point for Quo is back.
I agree.
Absolutely. Quo is back, and again, new album out that, like Martin mentioned, it follows the formula, but it's a great album to listen to. Enjoying it quite a bit.
That's great.
Quo is back, and I think that they have a couple more records in them.
Oh, without a doubt.
Looking into the future.
Yeah. And I saw them at the Fillmore. They played the Fillmore before they went to Anaheim and...
oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, so I saw them at the Fillmore. Shows, Sold out show. I was right at the front. My God, what a good concert.
It's funny because I was saying I didn't know what to expect. I was thinking, there might be like half full with just local. I go, who knows a Quo out here? And literally it was all people that drove up from Mexico, Mexico City, drove down from Canada, flew in from England, and they all had their giant banners, the British flag, the Canadian flag, and the Mexican fans all waving up. And it's like you're at a stadium show at the Small House of Blues, and I'm like blown away, and the band is just kicking ass live, and it's like, what have I missed?
And
what
everyone in the audience was dancing and jumping up and down on their
everyone's getting drunk. It was like going to concerts back in the 70s. It was like going through a time warp. It was like, holy shit.
And it was so bloody good, I had to call in sick the next day and drove all the way down to LA with a bloke that I'd never met before.
Did you see them on this tour, Martin? In 2000?
I've only seen them twice. I mean, they haven't been here for years and years and years. No, I've only seen them twice, and like I say, it was like 2000 and 2010, something like that, right?
Well, let's go.
I don't remember what years they were, but one of them must have been Heavy Traffic, so that's 2002.
Yeah.
So that must have been the first time, and then I saw them about 10 years after that.
Well, let's go ahead and close this off here. If there's anything else you want to touch on the whole Last Millennials, I know they just put out a record this year, Backbone, obviously, with just Francis as original member. Anything in closing this? So let's start with you, Martin.
Well, I mean, I like that Backbone does have Andy and it does have Rhino still, right?
Yeah.
Is that right? Yeah.
Yes.
So I mean, it's a legitimate lineup going back. What is that? 35 years, right? And even more if you consider the session work of Andy. But no, I think I just love this idea that they. I wouldn't say that Heavy Traffic recaptured their sound. I think it reinvented a perfect sound where they could sit and be at home with themselves. And moving forward, I love that there's just this great continuity between any originals that they write. So that's really cool. And I do agree the cover albums were a lot of fun.
Oh, without a doubt. And after Heavy Traffic, the funny thing is, they did another cover album. Now, it was in the contract, and I think that's what makes this Backbone so special. 2003 is when Heavy Traffic was out on tour, 2002. But here we are now, 2019, and they finally come out with another good original album. I did miss a couple of things, though, because I wasn't looking at my notes. These are the other albums, acoustic. They did two acoustic albums, 2016, 2014.
Yeah.
Bula Quo, now everyone that I talked to don't seem to like that, but I could see why they did that. That is like a tongue-in-cheek, fun project. They did a movie.
Quid
Quid Quo
great
Pro,
album.
yeah.
But this is where Status Quo is now in their stage of their career. They have nothing to prove to anybody, right? They can do whatever they want. They have found that signature sound. They've been in my life, since I was a kid, almost like a steady force, yes, with its ups and downs and great albums and not so great albums. But I've been a fan, I am a fan, and I will be a fan. I really enjoy Backbone. I'm glad I got to see them and meet them and hang out with them. Still, my favorite album is still Hello. Haven't changed my mind even after this discussion,
That's
but
okay.
followed very closely by Quo,
Yeah.
which seemed to have resonated more with you guys.
Yeah.
But I'm just a happy Quo fan.
You know, one thing I do want to touch on, when did Rick Parfit pass, 2 years ago? About 2 years ago. And here here in the States, it was, I heard, just being a metal fan, I knew about it. Nobody cared here in the States. It had to be a huge thing in England,
It
I
was
would
huge,
imagine.
yeah. It still is. I mean, everyone misses Rick. And, I think this new guy is doing a great job.
Who is he? Was he from?
He's
any
from
bands?
Ireland, from Belfast, I think.
Was he known or just a...
He was actually recommended by Rick.
Oh, wow.
He met Rick many times as a kid, and he's on YouTube being on sound checks with Rick.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And
So
playing,
they were-
at 14 years old and stuff.
wow.
Very, very good feeling. And I think his youth gives them
It's Richie
desire
Malone,
and
right?
passion. Richie
Richie
Malone.
Malone. Remember that name.
It gives them desire and passion to carry on.
Right on.
Hey, just one last question. Sorry, I know, Bob, you want to wrap this up, but Mick, give me your impression of Francis. Like, what kind of a guy is Francis?
I've never met him, but I've seen many an interview, and he's a very cocky, funny, but really nice guy. He says a lot of things in interviews that kind of tick people off, and you wonder why he says things, but he's just an honest guy. There was a time when he was my favourite, but Rick by far will always be my favourite. He's I think a musical genius. He's a perfectionist. I think he's insecure in many ways. He'd be the first one to admit it, but I think he's a good guy, but he just needs to be happy writing good songs, whether they're all different, whether they're not like Quo type songs. I think good songs are good songs.
I have met him a couple times, and I've interviewed him 3 or 4
Have you?
times.
Okay.
And over the years,
Yeah.
I've almost felt like he's gotten a little bit more addled and a little bit more Keith Richardish and hard to understand his sense of humor. Like he talks, he seems to talk faster. And the thoughts are kind of hard to figure out.
Yeah.
I felt that the last couple of times I talked to him that it's like I really have to concentrate to understand his point. I love the guy. I mean, he's one of my favorite people in the whole world.
Like I said, he's got nothing to prove. He's just being himself and trying to make himself happy and write out whatever else is left in his life and career.
And I think, there's so much pressure from fans and, the old school fans that want the old Quo back, and all of these influences that I think affect someone's mind. I think he's not willing to. He needs to make himself happy, and I think that's what he's doing. I think he's finally in a happy place.
I wonder if he's a little more eccentric than we all know.
Probably.
Yeah.
Probably.
I haven't read any of the Quo books. I have a couple. I've not read them completely, but I mean, obviously, there's a lot on them and there's a lot by them. I mean, that last one is an autobiography, so I'm sure we can all figure out exactly what he's like.
Well, I've got that one too. I don't know how long it's going to take me to open the first page, but because I'm terrible at reading, but that will be an interesting read. I think we will learn a lot about him.
Yes,
he seems like a good guy.
So, Martin, has this inspired you to write a Status Quo book, finally?
No, I mean, I get asked a lot, and it's just one of those bands that, unfortunately, the problem is there's a long swath of records that I don't know enough about, and I can't dedicate a whole chapter to. And, the extent of my Quo interviews are literally a few with Francis, a couple with Rick, and that's the end of it. So I have way too far to go. There's people way more qualified, all these people who have been in England with the band throughout all the years, all that kind of stuff. So I can't do it. I mean, there's just not. I don't have the knowledge base. I'm just way too behind the 8 ball.
So I did 2 interviews. One for the record company bio that was about a 3-hour interview, believe it or not.
Well, that's more than I've done over any of them.
When the record company saw it,
I don't add up to 3 hours.
Well, when the record company saw that I wrote a 14-page thing, when what those record company bios are, it should be 2 pages, right? They were laughing at me. It's like, come on, we can't use this.
This is a book.
And then of course the interview I did at the Chicago show. So I'm happy to share those if you ever get to a point where you want to do something.
No, man, you know what? We together, really, to get a book off the ground, I need to have talked to a band 20, 25 times before I feel like I could really do something, and I'm literally sitting at about 5 with Status Quo. So,
but I do recommend going back to their 80s and 90s.
I will.
catalog.
Yeah.
All of us. I think they're good songs. I think that they're probably one of the best bands ever to be around, in my honest opinion. And that's a huge statement.
Yeah.
I think they have had an excellent career and have written many great songs.
I'll definitely go back and listen
And they
to
still
these
bloody
albums.
rock.
Yeah.
That's a great closing statement.
Absolutely. Well, can you compete with that closing
I can't
statement,
compete
John?
with that. Mick is, like I said, probably the only other person I know here that was a bigger Quo fan than me. Bill Hale's a big Quo fan as well.
Yeah.
But,
Well, thank God for people like you and Toby and my friend Craig Williams that, turned me on to go, you got to get into Quo. You got to get the greatness of Quo, because like I said about their used albums as a kid, it was back then I was already into new wave of British heavy metal. It was early 80s, and it was like, this isn't heavy enough for me kind of thing. But Martin, I know you've got, we talked about, we had you on the Rainbow podcast. You got the new Rainbow book, Sensitive to Light, that came out. You got the new wave of British heavy metal book coming out too, right? Or is that out already?
No, well, that trilogy of those books is out, but no, the next one coming, which is at the printer right now, is called Holy Smoke, Iron Maiden in the 90s,
Right.
and I'm about 2/3 the way through A Merciful Fate.
That's going to be awesome.
Cool.
Very cool. Anything else before we do close this podcast? So, of course, MartinPopoff.com, right? That's simple.
Oh, yeah, for all the books and stuff, and we've got the new podcast, History in 5 Songs with Martin Popoff, and I'm on Overkill Reviews, all the banger stuff. We got a few of those coming up. That's about it.
Definitely check out Banger TV on YouTube.
And on our end, Dammaj record was reissued in Europe not that long ago.
Yeah, 2012.
And available. And Bob and I are finishing up the Bay Area Godfathers. So a lot of activity.
Dammaj and Mick and his brother Steve will be featured extensively in that. It's going to be a great movie, and it'll be coming out the beginning of the new year. So definitely look for that.
Cool.
All right, guys, gentlemen, this was a long one, but a good one. I learned a lot from this.
Yeah, me too, man.
Thank you for listening to the Shockwave Skull Sessions podcast. Subscribe and listen to all episodes by going to our pages on iTunes, Spreaker, YouTube, Spotify, and more. You can listen to all other episodes and access up-to-date information and news on the Shockwave Skull Sessions podcast by going to our website at www.shockwaveskullsessions.com. Email all comments, questions, and suggestions to shockwaveskullsessions@gmail.com.